You are listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, a weekly shortwave radio program and online podcast dedicated to uncensored, politically incorrect biblical teaching. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. And now the broadcast.
Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. I'm your host, Matthew Dyer. We are broadcasting around the world on shortwave radio on station WRMI in Okeechobee, Florida, going around the world. And we're also broadcasting on our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries, over on YouTube and Spotify and TuneIn, and other places after the fact as well. But those are our main outlets. I really appreciate all our listeners on all those different platforms that tune in every week. I really appreciate the emails that I get as well from people telling me that they enjoy these Saturday evening broadcasts and they look forward to them every week. That's very humbling for me to hear. I'm very glad that the material that I put out here is of interest to people and that they look forward to it. I'm really glad to hear that. The radio broadcast is one of the main outreach ministries, I guess, of Christian America Ministries. We have plenty of others, but this is our weekly program. For those listening, maybe just tuning in this evening. And what we try to do on this radio program is look at things in a biblical way. In the past, we've had a lot of guests on here lately. I haven't had a guest on since December, which we're going to change that here soon. I have several planned. But me, all by my lonesome or with a guest, we look at a topic biblically. Sometimes we even look at things historically and things of that nature, things that are just of interest to Christians. And when I started this program, I wanted to basically make a, without a better term for it, a Christian talk show, I guess you could say, a radio program for people like us to come and listen to topics that we are concerned about and have a small voice in the world, I guess you could say, even though it's very, very small compared to other ministries and other outlets. But we're trying our best to get truth out in the way we can, and it's been successful. It has. I think this November will be the third year of doing the radio broadcast, and I think we're into the fourth year already of the podcast, because this radio program started out as a podcast and then it went into a radio program / podcast, and that's where it's at right now. And we've been on a total of 3 radio stations during the tenure of the radio program, although we're only on one right now. We're on WRMI. I would like to expand to other radio stations, but the cost of it, I debate back and forth whether the cost of it is it's hard to tell. You invest a lot of money into a radio station for a period of time, and then you don't know if it's going to pay off. So I've done that with several radio stations and gotten good feedback, and then it just kind of dries up. So WRMI, our 9 p.m. Central Standard Time slot on 9395 has been very successful, and we may expand that in the future. We'll just see how everything progresses, but I really appreciate those that tune in every week. That's and send me emails and let me know how much they enjoy the program, and also those that contribute financially to keep this program on the radio waves and not just a podcast, which I think having it as a radio show is important as well, because we've gotten quite a few listeners that way, just tuning through the radio dials. All right, that's enough of me just gabbing here. Let's talk about we got 2 topics this evening. We're going to be doing part 4 of our A Case for Biblical Kinism, but I am decided to, the first part of this podcast, to do something a little different. And this may not even really matter to a lot of you all out there, but it may matter to some of my local people here in South Louisiana that tune in, or maybe South Mississippi or South Alabama. That tune in, because right now, for the rest of the world, that they don't know this, but right now in Louisiana particularly, and some parts of South Texas as well. We are in what they call Mardi Gras season, and you think Easter and Halloween and things like that are bad with pagan influence. You should see Mardi Gras down here. It's not just a New Orleans thing. It encompasses the entire state and the surrounding regions this time of year, and it actually starts shortly after New Year's and goes into well till Mardi Gras, which this year it's going to be that's going to be Tuesday. It's a Catholic holiday, although what I find weird about it is a lot of Catholics, all Catholics celebrate it down here, but you have a lot of Protestants, professing Protestants, and other so-called Christians that participate in these events. And when I mean events, I mean every town down here has their Mardi Gras parade and their celebration and things of that nature. And um, there's differing degrees of it. You got some people that will just go to a parade and participate in the parade. Then you got people that really get into the festivities of it from mid-January up until whenever Mardi Gras is. It fluctuates, and it is down here. A lot of people don't understand that it is pagan in origin. Much more than even some of the other holidays that we know are pagan. I won't get into those this evening, but I mean, Mardi Gras is pagan in origin. Even the Catholic Church, they agree that it's pagan in origin. It has pagan roots. So this evening, I wanted to play a video. It's audio for a video that I did probably 2.5 years ago. That is on YouTube. You can go watch the video, and it has some graphics and things like that. But I wanted to play the audio for the video on the radio program this evening. And the title of the video is Mardi Gras Christian? And the thumbnail says, Should Christians Celebrate Mardi Gras? And I know people from the outside of Louisiana are like, well, duh, of course we shouldn't. That's just silly, because their vision of Mardi Gras is Bourbon Street, Bourbon Street brawls and naked women and drunkenness, and that is a big part of it. Don't get me wrong. New Orleans is kind of the central of it, and there's a whole history of that. But it's in every city, every town in South Louisiana, South Alabama, South Mississippi, and so forth. And it is just there's a lot of history to it that people just have no idea about. And this all started when I moved down here well over almost 13, 14 years ago. I wrote a little trifold track called Is Mardi Gras Christian? In this video that you're going to listen to here is basically that track put into video form. I improved it a little bit, and I even did some research that you can see on the video on our YouTube channel. With some newspaper articles and things like that, where these people turn different cities over to different pagan gods, and they have these groups which are like secret societies called crews down here. And I don't mean 2 or 3 of them. I mean there's probably 100 of them, and you'll have the crew of Zeus, the crew of Satan, the crew of these different Greek and pagan gods. I mean, there's tons of them, and they're like a secret society, and their main focus is like floats and parades, and basically keeping up with these pagan traditions that are surrounded around Mardi Gras. And I could do a whole broadcast on it, but I don't want to, because there's just it's just not necessary, really. I mean, you can really knock it out very quickly. And why a Christian shouldn't do it. And I don't know if there's interest in the future, maybe we can do a whole broadcast on it, but I doubt there will be. But I do want to play this video because this sparked from a conversation that my wife and I had at the chiropractor a few weeks ago. No, actually, no, it was last week. And one of the girls there was talking about Mardi Gras, and she was asking us if we were going to any parades or something like that. And well, we told her no. And then when she got to my wife, she had started talking to her in a little bit more detail than she had myself, and she had asked my wife if Mardi Gras had any deeper meaning, and and my wife proceeded to tell her, yeah, it's pagan. It's a pagan holiday, and the girl's like, what are you talking about? And she's like, well, what do you think they're doing when they turn cities over to other gods? They have ceremonies to turn cities over to other gods. And she was just absolutely speechless at that point and changed the subject because she had never thought about it. She said, huh. So she said, I guess there is a deeper meaning to it. So anyway, that's kind of what sparked this segment in this broadcast. So without further ado, here's that video. Is Mardi Gras Christian for you to listen to? Here we go. If you live in South Louisiana, or maybe even another southern state, as soon as Christmas and New Year's are over, many people automatically go into decorating and dressing for the holiday known as Mardi Gras. Just the words Mardi Gras, you may have thoughts of drunkenness parties on Bourbon Street, or maybe even women pulling up their breasts to earn colorful beads. The parties and parades begin weeks in advance from the actual day, and it brings in millions of dollars to the state of Louisiana and surrounding communities. New Orleans seems to be the capital in the United States for Mardi Gras festivals, although it is celebrated around the world. The city of New Orleans, as of 2009, says that this Mardi Gras celebration results in a direct economic impact of $145.7 million and an indirect impact of $322 million to the city. It's not hard to see with those numbers where the motivation to these holidays and celebrations come from, and that is money. I have read booklets and heard sermons concerning the origins of Christmas, Easter, Halloween, and the question of whether Christians should be involved in such events. But I have never read or heard a sermon concerning Mardi Gras. Now, to many of you, if you're not in Louisiana, you may be wondering what the big deal is. It's obviously a Catholic holiday, but in Louisiana, many people who call themselves Protestants celebrate it as well. And when you ask somebody the origins of Mardi Gras, they reply that it is a Christian holiday. This video is to put that statement to the test and let you decide for yourself, using the Bible, is Mardi Gras Christian and biblical, or is it a pagan tradition? Mardi Gras simply means Fat Tuesday in the French. The date changes from time to time, but is always 47 days before the Catholic Easter. Fat Tuesday is the traditional name for the day before Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent in the Roman Catholic Church. Lent is the preparation celebration in which a Catholic prepares for Easter. Catholics are supposed to not eat meat, although fish meat is allowed, during this time after Ash Wednesday. And stop doing sinful deeds during this time as well, like swearing, smoking, drinking, whatever it may be. They're to fast from these things that they consider sin. And this may seem harmless enough, but Mardi Gras, or Fat Tuesday, is the day in which they are to feast or glutton upon meats and sinful deeds before their fast of such things. Nowhere in Scripture can we find where we as Christians are supposed to partake of sinful deeds that we're not supposed to be doing prior to fasting of those deeds. Indulging on as much sin as possible until a period of temporary fasting does not make one think that God's way is correct and that sin is really bad. Romans 13:13 through 14 says this, "Let us walk honestly, as in the day, not in riot and in drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envy, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust therein." Romans 12:1 through 2 says this, "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove that which is good and acceptable and perfect will of God." By celebrating Mardi Gras, we are not showing that we are fully committing ourselves to the Lord Jesus Christ and His commandments. We are displaying acts of evil. We are displaying acts of drunkenness and paganism, which is not a Christian thing. According to Catholic.org, says this concerning the origins of Mardi Gras, quote, "The celebration of Mardi Gras has its roots in the pagan Roman celebration of Lupercalia. This was a February holiday, and it honored the Roman god of fertility. It involved feasting, drinking, and carnival behavior. However, with the rise of the church in Rome, Christian teaching and morals took root, but there always remained a strong need to blend ancient Roman traditional practices with the growing Christian faith. The blending of tradition with new religion beliefs was a common practice in the ancient world, and it helped people transition away from paganism." End quote. Mardi Gras or Lent are not commanded in the Bible, but rather come from pagan origins and pagan beliefs that the Roman Catholic Church assimilated into their own church tradition. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29 through 32 says this, "When the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whither thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them, and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself that thou be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God, for every abomination to the Lord which he hateth have they done unto their gods, for even their sons and their daughters have burnt in the fire to their gods. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. Thou shalt not add thereunto, nor diminish from it." 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 14 through 18 says this, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God hath said, I will dwell in them, and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty." Now in these verses, it's clear that the Lord wants us to remain pure and separate from the things that are not of God. I recommend you to read and study these things out, and do as 2 Timothy 2:15 says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Now, a few other things I want to add before we close this video. Mardi Gras, in New Orleans at least, they are organized by what they call crews, Krews. It is interesting to know that most of these parades are organized by these crews in New Orleans and put on by these organizations. They are somewhat of a secret society, secret private groups in New Orleans formed around the 1850s to help organize parades to keep them less violent. The first crew was called the Mystic Crew of Comus. Comus was a Greek god. Today in New Orleans, these crews are responsible for organizing, and they come up with all the symbols and traditions that are Mardi Gras. I'm only going to list you a few of the crews that are in New Orleans that are responsible for organizing the celebrations just in the city of New Orleans. And let me ask you this question as I'm reading these names off. Do any of these sound Christian to you? Or are these simply remnants of paganism in our culture? The first crew I want to read is the Knights of Babylon. The crew of Iris, Greek goddess of the rainbow. The crew of Isis, Egyptian goddess. Knights of Nemesis, Greek god of retribution. The crew of Nyx, Greek goddess of the night. The crew of Perseus, the Greek hero who slew Medusa. The crew of Thoth. Thoth is the name for the Egyptian patron of wisdom and the inventor of science, art, and letters. The crew of Argus, the Greek god of the all-seeing with 100 eyes, just to name a few. Now let me ask you once again, are any of these things of Christianity, or any of these things of the Bible? But rather these are, once again, remnants of paganism. So if you celebrate Mardi Gras and you think that it is just a harmless holiday of parades and fun and little traditions, I urge you to please search out the Scriptures and find out if celebrating such a tradition is something that God would want us to do. Is it something that Christians should participate in? And I believe the answer is no. But I pray that you take the time to search that out yourself. Thank you for watching. So there you have it. Is Mardi Gras Christian? You can watch that video if you want to watch some of the graphics on the screen at my YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries on YouTube. And if you're in South Louisiana, maybe you can share that video around here locally before next week. Get people educated on it. All right, now to the main subject of this broadcast. This is going to be part 4 in our series in a case for Biblical Kinism, which is coming out. This series is coming out before my book, which is by the same title, A Case for Biblical Kinism, which will be out in print probably sometime here in March. I'm hoping. It is still going through the reviewing process. I've sent it out to several people and making small little tweaks here and making sure there's no errors in it. And, the process of, writing a book. I'm hoping to have it finalized at least in the middle of March, and then perhaps have it ready and available by the end of March, early April. We'll see. I'm not sure yet. This being such a controversial subject, I do want to make sure that, all my T's are crossed and all my I's are dotted and so forth and so on. But as of where it is right now, it's going to be 86 pages, and it is all going to be surrounding this subject of what is biblical kinism. What does the Bible have to say about it? And it's going to deal with immigration. It's going to deal with miscegenation, race mixing. It's going to deal with the one race theory and things of that nature. Now, a few people last week commented under part 3 of this broadcast and said this was the first one that they were watching and somebody sent them over. If you are one of those people, I would recommend to please go back to part 1 of this radio series and listen to part 1, because you may be a little confused. If not, you want to go to part 1 and go all the way through. But each broadcast does stand on its own. But part 1 kind of sets the tone of what we're talking about in this broadcast. Now, we are going to touch on one of the bigger objections that you will hear as a biblical kinist. And that if you're presenting something like interracial marriage is wrong, you will hear something like this, that, listen, what you're teaching is wrong, it's a sin, because the Bible says that Moses married a black woman, and Miriam, his sister, held similar views as you just presented, and the Bible says she was cursed white for her sin of racism through leprosy. So what God did is he cursed her with leprosy, and she turned white from the leprosy as punishment for her being against an interracial marriage. Now, that's about how the objection would go. And I'm sure many of you can comment below how many times, you can tell me how many times you've heard of that objection. Now, because every biblical kinist has heard it at least once. And this passage comes from Numbers chapter 12, verse 1 through 10. And we're going to go ahead and read those 10 verses if you want to go ahead and turn there in Numbers chapter 12. And it says this: And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. And now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. And the Lord spake suddenly unto Moses, and unto Aaron, and unto Miriam, Come out ye three unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And they three came out, and the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud, and stood in the door of the tabernacle, and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth, and he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I the Lord will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches, and the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed, and the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow, and Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. End quote. Now, that's the passage. That is the passage that many people will use as an objection to Biblical Kinism. They will say that interracial marriage is acceptable because Moses married a black woman. Now, note here, the passage doesn't say that Moses married a black woman. It doesn't. It says that Moses, it says here, and Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. It says he married an Ethiopian woman. So everyone's natural reaction is, well, Ethiopian woman now, well, that's definitely black. You think of a modern Ethiopian in 2025, that is a black woman. So therefore, thousands of years ago, that Ethiopian must have been black as well. Well, if you know anything about mass migrations, you know that racial groups move all around the world throughout history, and they don't always reflect the same in an area as they did thousands of years ago. But the passage doesn't say that he married a black woman. The Hebrew word in this passage that is translated Ethiopian in the King James, which is what we just read, it just means a Cushite woman, a descendant of Cush. Now, the Cushites were descendants of Cush, Noah's grandson, by Ham. So they would have been of the same racial stock as the Israelites. They wouldn't have been Israelites, but they would have been of the same racial stock. If we read in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6, it says this: And the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah, and Sabbatah, and Remah, and Tabbatek, and the sons of Remah, Sheba, and Dedon, end quote. And that's where you have the sons of Cush. Cush was a grandson of Ham. And Bible translations such as the New American Standard, the English Standard Version, even the terrible NIV, the Legacy Standard Bible, the Amplified Bible, the Webster's Bible Translation, English Revised Version, American Standard Version, along with many other translations, all render this word correctly translated as Cushite. The false theory that Moses married a black woman has its origins in the Jewish Babylonian Talmud. Now take note of this. This is very important, because I don't know how many books I've read where it says that all of Ham's descendants were black. And basically that's where the theory comes that, Japheth was white, Shem was Oriental, and then Ham was black when they came off the ark, is how a lot of them will portray that. But this idea of this Cushite woman being black has its roots in the Babylonian Talmud because of the curse that came upon in Genesis chapter 9. Now, the Babylonian Talmud teaches that Ham was cursed by Noah in Genesis chapter 9, and it turned his skin into black. Now, that was the curse, is him turning into a black man. And how they portray this in the Babylonian Talmud is all his descendants after him were cursed with black skin. The Mormons even have a similar belief. They believe that I think it's the angels beforehand that we're all basically it's incarnation that rebelled against God, that were neutral. They were cursed on the earth with black skin, and that's why the Mormons a lot of times they believe before 1970 something they believe that black people were cursed and they wouldn't allow them in the church. But that's another story. But this whole theory of the Cushites being black comes from the Talmud. It is Judeo-Christianity, or let's drop the Christian. It's just Judeo doctrine. That's what it is. And I'm going to read to you from the Talmud. This is the Sanhedrin 108b, verse 15. And this is what it says. The dog and the raven and Ham, son of Noah. The dog was punished in that it is bound. The raven was punished in that it spits. And Ham was afflicted in that his skin turned black. End quote. So anyone that promotes this idea that Moses married a black woman unknowingly is giving credence to the idea that all black people came from Ham because he was cursed with black skin. This is not true. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches that Noah cursed Canaan, Ham's son, Genesis 9:25, who was the son of Ham, due to what I believe was incest. You can read Leviticus 18:7. I think that's the sin that was happening there, and that's why Canaan was cursed and not Ham. And it says nothing of black skin in that passage. Nor does the Bible teach having black skin is a curse. Now, think about that for a minute. Where in the Bible does it teach having black skin is a curse? Now, I believe God created all the different races, black and white, and so forth, separately. And he created the black people, just like he created the white people, separate creations. I'm a polygenesis in that. I believe that they were created separately. We've done programs on that before, and we may even touch on it again in more detail in this series as we go on. But nowhere do we have any evidence that being black is a curse. It's not. So when people say that Moses married a black woman and that Ethiopians were black, which really should be Cushites, they're promoting Talmudic doctrine. That is a Talmudic doctrine straight from the Babylonian Talmud. It is Judaism is what it is. And it should be rejected and proven as much, because that's not true. And a lot of people, I'll say, a lot of people that promote that Moses married a black woman do not realize what they're promoting. They do not realize in the roots the idea of Moses marrying a Cushite, and therefore she must be black. They don't believe that that is straight out of the Talmud, but it is. That's something that has crept over into Christianity in many people's minds straight out of the Babylonian Talmud, like a lot of other doctrines as well. I remember my dad talking about years ago, he had asked a preacher that we were attending his church. This was, I think, long before I was born. And he asked him where black people came from. You know, in the Bible, where does black people come from? I forget what the context of the conversation was. And he very quietly leaned over and he whispered that they came from the curse of Ham and curse of Canaan, I guess, because Ham didn't get cursed, but the curse of Canaan, and that's where black people came from. And that wasn't that long ago, and it's still being promoted. But they may not say that from the pulpit, but a lot of them believe that, and that's just not what the Bible teaches. I want to read a quote here from the late Pastor Sheldon Emery of America's Promise, in his 1979 The Answering Service, when he was asked about Moses' wife. He wrote the following here. We're going to read. For those that don't know, Pastor Emery, he had a publication called The Answering Service, where I guess he would take questions that he'd received over the years, and he would answer them briefly and print them in his newsletters, I guess, and send those out in his newsletters, I should say. And he would do that, I'm assuming, I don't know how, if he did it every year or what, but it's not a bad idea, and answer common questions that he would get. So this is what he said concerning the land of Cush and this Cushite woman. Quote, according to Bullinger's The Companion Bible, Arabia was the land of Cush. He says that this woman was probably Zipporah, the daughter of Reuel, that is, Jethro, the priest of Midian. See Exodus 2:21 and 3:1. Bullinger further suggests that since Zipporah was living in or near the area of Cush, she could have been considered a Cushite, not by descent, but by street address. The connection between the Midianites and the land of Cush is well known to Bible scholars. According to Sir R. Burton's The Land of Midian Revisited, Mount Sinai or Horeb was in or in close proximity to Midian. See Hastings Bible Dictionary, Volume 2, page 366, under Midian. We also know from Genesis 25, 1 through 4, that the Midianites were descendant from Abraham through his wife Keturah. And verse 4 says that they settled east of Canaan. They apparently were squeezed out of that area by the Moabites and the Amorites, for we later find them in the Sinai desert. In fact, Josephus tells us that after Moses fled Egypt, he came to the city of Midian, which lay upon the Red Sea, and was so dominated from one of Abraham's sons by Keturah. Antiquities 2:11:1. So there is a good possibility that this Cushite woman was either Zipporah or someone else living in the general area, not from modern-day Ethiopia in Africa, although this area was also settled by white people for a long time. End quote. So you see there, the area there was just the land of Cush. It wasn't known for having a population of black people. And the idea of all the people in that area being black was just a theory. It's really just a theory that came about from people misunderstanding where the location was, and where the Cushites settled in the area of Midian, and also the common misunderstanding that people can live in an area and be called by the name of the area, but also not be an ethnic, racial person that that area is named after. And that happens a lot of cases, especially here in America. A lot of cities are named after Indians and Indian names, like Natchez, Mississippi, or even Mississippi itself. But that doesn't mean you're an Indian if you live in those areas. Same thing goes for someone that lives in Austin, Texas. Doesn't mean they're a Mexican. It's an area, and when you have mass migration in and out of areas over time, the demographics change. Now, another thing that will get brought up concerning this subject is in the book of Jasher, which is not canon. I don't consider it of authority whatsoever. It says that Moses had another wife, and that's what this is being spoken about, and she was a Canaanite, and she was only a Cushite by citizenship, or she lived in that land, and Moses accepted her as a gift, but he never had relations with her, knowing that it was against God's law and that it was forbidden. A lot of people will hang their hat on that. I would not even go there, because the book of Jasher is questionable. It is not what I would consider an authority, somewhere to build doctrine. And when you are presenting this to someone, they're going to know that, and they're not going to want to pull some kind of doctrine from some obscure document that is not very old. The book of Jasher is not very old. The oldest manuscripts we have of it are very, very early. or excuse me, they're very late, I should say. So I wouldn't even go there. I wouldn't even bring it up. I didn't even mention it in my book because it is not something that we need to pull doctrine from. We need to pull doctrine from Scripture alone and not other books that some people deem as Scripture that are questionable. So I wanted to add that in there because some people will try to do that, and I wouldn't even bring it up. It's not a very good thing to do. Okay, now in the next portion of this broadcast, we're going to be talking about Rahab. Was Rahab a Canaanite? Because another objection to biblical kinism goes about like this. What about Rahab? She was a Canaanite, and they were forbidden to be married into, and she is in the genealogy of Jesus. So this means that Jesus came from a mixed lineage and is part Canaanite. That is about how the objection goes. And if this is true, then it makes a lot of laws against marrying into the Canaanites and other forbidden lineages given in the Old Testament, given to us by God, to seem a bit foolish and confusing. 1 minute God says, do not marry into these people, and the next minute he has this forbidden lineage in the genetic line of the Messiah, which was supposed to be without spot or blemish. We read about Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. And because of time, I'm not going to read this entire passage. If you want to, go to Joshua chapter 2, verse 1 through 24, and you can read the entire exchange there that the Israelites had with Rahab. And I'll sum it up. Basically, the spies came in by order of Joshua into the city of Jericho secretly. And they came across Rahab, and she offered her assistance. That there was rumors and word of the Israelites conquering people, and quite frankly, the people in the city were afraid. And she made a deal with them that she would help them if her and her household would survive the onslaught, so to speak. And they did. Now, when you read that passage, you can read the entire Old Testament concerning Rahab, every passage that her name pops up, which is in the book of Joshua. She is never once called a Canaanite. Not one single time. Her being a Canaanite is an assumption that she was in the city of Jericho. Now, you and I both know that just because someone lives in a certain city doesn't mean that they are a certain ethnic or racial group. It just doesn't work that way. We have no idea Rahab's family history in this passage. We don't know where she came from. But it does not call her a Canaanite. So the people that say, well, Rahab was a Canaanite, no, it doesn't say that. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that she was a Canaanite. And that is a big clue to who she is. And the main story of Rahab is there in Joshua chapter 2, and she helps the Israelites conquer Jericho. And if you continue reading in Joshua chapter 6, verse 17, we see that Joshua and the Israelites allowed her and her family to live, and even allowed them to stay in the land. Now, it says that they allowed her to stay on the outside of the camp. But remember, in Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 3, it was forbidden by God if she was a Canaanite to even live, and let alone stay on the outside of the camp or in the land. Now, a lot of people will say, well, they showed her grace or something like that. But please notice that she is never identified as a Canaanite in this passage. Canaanites were forbidden to be there in the land, obviously. And in the law there, it was forbidden to make a covenant or a deal with a Canaanite, which is exactly what Joshua and his men did. Now, although her and her family lived in the Canaanite city of Jericho, it is complete speculation if she was a Canaanite. Like I said before, much like if I identify a man living in San Antonio, Texas as being a Mexican, that doesn't mean he's a Mexican. Is it likely? Yes, but it doesn't mean he is. Much like in London, England right now, I could say that everybody in London is a Caucasian, but that we know that's not true. Maybe at one point in history, yes, it may have been, but not anymore. So, as an example of someone being misidentified in Scripture, of how they dress or where they live, we can see in Exodus chapter 2, verse 18 through 19, how Moses was thought to be an Egyptian by the daughters of Reuel when he was truly an Israelite. It says here in verse 18 through 19 in Exodus chapter 2, quote, "And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flocks." End quote. Now, I believe it's very unlikely that Rahab was a Canaanite, because God was blessing Joshua and the Israelites in battle. And God only blessed them when they were doing what God had obeyed them to do. And God obeyed and commanded them not to make any deals or covenants with the Canaanites, which if Rahab was, that's exactly what they did. And he forbade them from being in the land. They were to be driven out. So right there should give us a hint that there's something more to this story, because Rahab was allowed to stay with her and her family. And I know in a lot of people, they're like, well, they just showed her grace and they allowed her to live, and they were allowed to bend the rules just a little bit. But no, they weren't. God was blessing them in battle. He would have punished them if they had been disobeying it. So I think that is obvious that she was not a Canaanite for that fact, other than the fact that it's never mentioned that she is a Canaanite. Now, let's examine where Rahab is mentioned in the New Testament, because this is where a lot of people go. They don't go to the Old Testament and read the commands given to drive the Canaanites out and try to figure out how they're being blessed for allowing this Canaanite and disobeying that law. They go over to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, where it says here, "And Solomon begot Boaz of Rahab, and Boaz begot Obed of Ruth, and Obed begot Jesse." End quote. And as you all know, Jesse being the father of David, the grandfather of Solomon. So we're talking about the line of the king, the line of the Messiah here. And they will say that this Rahab, in the King James, it's spelt different. It's spelt R-A-C-H-A-B. That's important. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But they'll say that Rahab married this Israelite man named Solomon, and they begot Boaz, who we see in the story of Ruth. And Boaz married Ruth, and they had a son named Obed, and that man had a son named Jesse, who was the father of David. And that would make David a Canaanite, by part Canaanite through one of his great-grandmothers, Rahab, if this theory is correct. And for those that also believe this, they will teach that Ruth was a racial Moabite, which we'll get to in the next broadcast. So David wasn't a Israelite at all. He was a Heinz 57 and was illegitimate according to God's law for being king, if these theories are correct. Now, it would seem as a surface reading of this passage that Rahab was the mother of Boaz, who married Ruth in the book of Ruth, and then Boaz was born of Rahab after the conquest of Jericho. The dating of the conquest of Jericho is believed to have taken place around 1406 BC. Now, that's an important date. Keep that in mind. In Haley's Bible Handbook, written by Henry H. Haley, he stated the following concerning the conquest of Jericho in his book. Now, make note of this. Quote, "Jericho has been much excavated in the 20th century by Warren, by Sellon, by Witzinger, by Gerstang, and by Quignon, and by an Italian team. What John Gerson thought were the walls destroyed by Joshua turned out to actually be the walls of a city that existed about 1,000 years before Joshua. However, Kathleen Quignon negativism about the correlation of the biblical and archaeological data is also not warranted. Bryant Wood, in his analysis of all the data, has reasonably suggested the following. What the archaeologists call city 4 was destroyed about 1400 BC. This data agrees well with the internal chronology of the Bible, which would place the conquest of Joshua at about 1406 BC. It seems that the city 4 was first destroyed by a burnt debris, in some places 3 or more feet thick, has been found at various locations on the wall. Among the debris were pottery, household utensils, and even carbonized grain, indicating that the destruction had taken place in the spring of the year, just after the harvest. 2:6-3:15, and note that the Israelites celebrated the Passover just before the conquest of Jericho. 5:10 and 3:15. It also indicates that there had not been a long siege, and large quantities of grain were found. The biblical texts say the city was taken within 7 days, 6:15, and that the inhabitants did not have time to flee with their belongings before the destruction. In addition, carbon 14, C14, test on the organic material placed the destruction at about 1400 BC. Even Egyptian scarabs, seals, found in tombs there do not name pharaohs who ruled after 14 BC. End quote. Now, right here, if the destruction of Jericho happened around 1406 BC, like Henry Haley agrees, along with a lot of other people, if you do research into it, this would mean that David was born around 1036 BC. Now, because the Bible tells us in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, that, quote, in the 480 year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, end quote. So if we take 480 years and subtract 40 years for the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, and then subtract 70 years for the age of David, 2 Samuel 5:4, we end up with 370 years between Jericho and David's birth. Now think about that. 370 years before David's birth. So from Jericho to David, 370 years. This would mean that there are 4 generations that must be born within 370 years if Rahab in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5 is the same person as Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. In my book, I have a chart that came out of Robert Allen Balakias' commentary on the epistle of James chapter 2, where he tries to make sense of the different theories, explaining that in his view that the Rahab in Jesus' genealogy is a different one than Jericho, which I would agree with him. And he has on this chart, which I'll try to explain it the best I can, he has a conservative estimate on a timeline, and then he has an extreme estimate on fitting these generations in 370 years. The conservative estimate has Solomon at age 30 at Jericho. 10 years later, at age 40, after Jericho, he married Rahab, and Boaz was born shortly after that. Boaz, at 55 years old when he married Ruth. Then Obed was born 9 months later. Then Obed was 40 years old when Jesse was born. And then Jesse was 70 years old when David was born. And that would put us 195 years short in that time frame. Now, the extreme estimate that he has on this chart is Solomon was 80 years old when he married Rahab, and then he had Boaz shortly after that, and then Boaz was 100 years old when he had Obed, and then Obed was 100 years old when he had his son Jesse, and then Jesse was 78 years old when David was born, and then that leaves us 12 years short. So even with that extreme chart, we know that it doesn't fit. So what that leads us to think is that if we can't fit all those generations practically in that 370 year period, we may be talking about a different Rahab, because it is very unlikely for 4 generations to have children over the age of 78 years old. It's just very unlikely. I mean, that is, I'm not even sure if that's ever happened before that we have a record of it. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. For men at the age of 100, for 2 generations, age at 80 before that, and the age of 80 of that, sire children, and still live a good while after that, yes, it's very possible, but it's very, very unlikely. It is more likely that we are talking about a different Rahab altogether in this passage, and there's evidence to that. A piece of evidence to support that is the Rahab in Jesus' genealogy was not the same person as in Joshua. In the New Testament, there are 2 Greek words used for each of these names. Now, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, there was a specific Greek word. It is Strong's 4477, and it's transliterated as Rahab there in the King James. And then in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, and James 2:25 uses a different Greek word for Rahab, which we know that is speaking of the Rahab in Joshua. That is Strong's 4460. Which is translated as Rahab. It's also interesting to note that the Greek word Rahab there in Matthew chapter verse 1 through 5 does not appear anywhere in the Greek Septuagint, nowhere. But the Greek word for Rahab that is found in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 31 and James 2:25 appears in the Septuagint in the book of Joshua, speaking of that Rahab. So the Septuagint would give us evidence that that is the Rahab being spoken about, and that there is just a difference in this Greek word because it's speaking of a different person. Maybe it's someone that was named similarly to Rahab there, but it's not the same person. And the timeline makes sense with that. And the fact that different Greek words are used for both of those passages lean credibility to that. And I think that's a better solution. I don't have time in this broadcast. I was going to talk about whether or not Rahab was a harlot or a practicing harlot. That there is a subchapter in the book on that, but we don't have time in this broadcast to cover it, and it's not really technically related to this subject, but it is interesting, and I have a supplemental section in the book addressing that topic since it is, I did have a chapter on Rahab in there. All right, well, thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. I hope that you enjoyed this broadcast. And if you are listening to us on Shortwave Radio, please be sure to go to our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org, and send us a contact there through our contact page, and let us know how and where you're listening in the world. And if you give us your mailing address, we will send you a free copy of one of my books just as a thank you for doing that. Also, if you're listening to us on Spotify, please be sure to rate this podcast and there on the Spotify page. That will help other people find the podcast. So I appreciate anyone that could do that. We have I think a rating, 7 people that's rated it so far. Anyway, thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Come back next week for another broadcast.
Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. If you are blessed by this outreach ministry, please consider going to www.christianamericaministries.org to our contact page and donating to our radio ministry to help keep this program on the air. We appreciate your support.
You have been listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Come back next week on Shortwave Radio or on the internet for our next broadcast. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. Thank you for listening.